5, 6, 7, 8.
Welcome to the EX podcast, where every week I talk with business leaders, authors, and disruptors on how the workplace is changing. This podcast brings a different lens to the conversation around HR transformation, company culture, and employee engagement. It brings a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Why? Because companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. It is time we put people first to rehumanize the workplace. Simply because leaders who don't care about their employees will eventually be surrounded by people who don't care about their business. Today's guest is Damon, Director of Employee Experience and HR Design at IBM. Today with Damon, we talk about why he moved from design to the world of HR and employee experience, how to apply customer experience mindsets and methodologies to the HR world, how to get internal buy-in from various stakeholders when it comes to EX initiatives, how to build an EX team and work with a more conventional HR team, where to start and which pitfalls to avoid, and how Damon sees the future of EX at IBM. Support for this podcast is brought to you by Culture Amp. Eliminate the guesswork of company culture with Culture Amp, the world's largest independent employee feedback platform. Culture Amp goes beyond aggregating survey results to deliver rich insights and data-driven action plans on an easy-to-use interface. With a powerful platform, science-backed surveys, and a focus on your customer's success, Culture Amp helps you increase employee engagement and build a positive company culture. Start developing a deep understanding of your employees' experience today by visiting cultureamp.com/future. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Damon. And because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it will help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next event, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummits.com or on Twitter @EX_summits. All right, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Today's guest is Damon. Damon is calling from the sunny San Diego, and he's the Director of Employee Experience Design at IBM. Damon, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Stefan. Happy to be here.
You've got quite an interesting and I would say unconventional background to where you are today. So can you share with us a bit about what you did, and then we'll go more specifically into the conversation of what you're doing currently at IBM?
Sure, happy to. It's depending on how far back you go, it's quite a colorful story, but I'll just say that, I'll summarize by saying I've just always had this passion for things that are both technical and creative. So I've worn both hats since I was young, and really how that manifested itself in the early years was this early passion I had for the art and the science of architecture. So that was my first, became my first field of study, but it was through my architecture work that coming on the scene at the time, way back then, was computer-aided drafting and design, which really got me into computers and technology, which led to studying computer science as well. But that blend of technical and creative has sort of been with me all along. That quickly led me to IBM, and I would say that many of my early roles at IBM were very technical and very client facing. And so in order to meet this need I have to express the creative side, I actually spent a lot of time doing freelance design work or client projects sort of on the side. And it started with things like graphic and visual design, and then over time morphed into more web design and web development.
Why the transition to HR then from a design background? So why the transition to HR, and how did the move happen at IBM?
Yeah, it's quite a story. So I think that part of the story really starts with, 5 or 6 years ago, with the leadership of Phil Gilbert, our general manager of design. We set off to build the largest enterprise design capability in history. And, I wasn't part of IBM Design at the time, but after a year or so into that mission, I did end up joining the organization. And my first role there was to help lead the front-end developer, discipline and community at IBM, which is very closely aligned with design. And over time, that role expanded to cover all of the design disciplines. And so I was leading what we called the people programs in the design organization. And because a formalized design program or designer roles weren't standardized or scaled across IBM, we built a lot of our people programs and experiences from scratch. So when I think about, the programs and the experiences we were creating, it was everything from how we recruited designers to training and enablement, all the way up through, how we define executive roles and make those appointments. And so it was during those years that, I became a champion of things like Agile delivery practices and became a really deep subject matter expert in design thinking and IBM's version of design thinking, which is called enterprise design thinking. And so the fun part of the story is that these people programs and these experiences that we were creating caught the eye of our corporate HR team, and not necessarily in a good way at first, because we had deviated quite a bit from the standard experiences that were being provided by the corporate team. And at the time, I was like, "Oh man, I'm in for it. Like I'm in trouble here." But instead, those conversations went incredibly well, and it was how can we leverage some of these ideas, and how can we scale them more broadly across the company? So it was at that time that we hatched the strategy to build a design team dedicated to HR.
When we talked to prepare this conversation today, you mentioned that IBM started really focusing on the user experience several years ago to design new products, and that it was just a matter of time before the transition was made to the HR space. Now, when you think of customer experience or employee experience, for any organization that was not born with an obsession on the user experience or the employee experience, we're talking about a radical mind shift and operational model. From the transformation that you were part of at IBM, do you think that this type of transformation have to start on the consumer side, or can it start on the employee side right away?
That's a really good question. I feel that the today's statement is that most companies, especially large enterprises, but even most startups I see, are really taking similar approaches when it comes to how they meet the needs of their customers. So whether it's delivering products or services, I feel like it's pretty common in the industry to have this very user-centered or customer-centered point of view. And so we were taking a very similar approach in the earlier years of our design program of really focusing our new design capability at our product space, but the outcomes and the transformation we were seeing in our product space by using, design thinking and other tools, it became clear as the programs were maturing and the outcomes were accelerating that, wow, we could use this in many other parts of the company as well. So we started exploring how these could be used in non-product areas of the company. But knowing that, that was our journey or our story, I don't think that's the required path. I think any team, any company could jump right in and start to leverage the benefits of frameworks like Agile and design thinking against their employee experiences.
There's a lot of talk, obviously, around the employee experience. And I think for many organizations, there's a very good intent, genuine intent to talk about the employee experience. But many organizations don't necessarily know where to start or don't have the right mindset and the right structure in place. It's really hard to sell internally to the executive team what it takes, whether it's in terms of financial or human resources, to start the employee experience journey. From your experience at IBM, how do you sell the idea internally, both to the management and to the employees?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and I'd say that everyone sells. Especially in the corporate context, I feel like we're always selling, per se. I think it's a really important leadership skill. Not a big fan of the word sell. Sometimes some of the feelings it can generate can definitely be on the negative side. But I'd say if I were to describe how we sell our ideas, it's primarily, in our case, I would say, how we demonstrate value. So whether it's value to the business, value to employees, or value to individuals, demonstrating value, helps the ideas sell themselves. So as an example, for any project that we're involved in, if we've done it right, we've done a lot of sort of the best practices. It's we've leveraged design thinking. We've identified who our users and stakeholders are. We've researched what their user needs are, what the business needs are. We've identified, pain points or gaps or friction, and then we've ideated on solutions with a multidisciplinary team. Importantly, integrated sponsor users. And then quickly and iteratively delivered either a proof of concept or a minimum delightful experience. So if we've had an opportunity to do those kinds of things, and you can do, it sounds like a lot, but you can do some of these very, very quickly, the outcome of that small investment tends to be a story that can sell itself. You're telling the story of the value of what's possible, and that tends to go a long, long way. And we find that so many times there's just been this overwhelming eagerness of, individuals, teams, but also our leadership to want to jump in and collaborate with this new way of working. It actually makes work interesting and exciting. And then the last thing I'd say is, of course, it never hurts. The traditional stuff still applies. It never hurts to have a good pitch deck. Especially if you have a good human-centered story to tell as a part of it.
How do you build a team around the employee experience, and how do you work alongside with, I would say, more conventional HR people?
Well, I hope that what we represent at some point, hopefully, will become the future of what's considered a conventional HR team. I would love to see that.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I guess, I think what sets our team apart from most that I talk to are, I can think of kind of three things. One is our deep design craft. We're all professionally trained designers. Two is that, the experience that we have with applying Agile delivery practices and probably most important is our deep subject matter expertise in enterprise design thinking practices. But out of those three, I think the part that is most interesting is that the design craft one is really the only thing that sits out of reach for most or some HR professionals, because anyone in any role can accelerate their outcomes with Agile and design thinking being woven in and becoming a part of their day-to-day job or day-to-day role. So I guess I only say that to say that, like, I think HR teams, talking about more, like you mentioned, the conventional HR teams, I think HR professionals are inherently human-centered. It's kind of baked into the profession. But what I personally find a lot of times is that most are like deep subject matter experts on the policies and procedures of the offerings that HR provides, but oftentimes are sort of mistaking that deep subject matter expertise as an understanding of the experiences that our offerings create for our users or for our employees. So I really like the quote of "We're not our users." I think that there's no way to say it better. We're, even as HR professionals, we're not the user, right? We're not representative of how our employees will consume or experience our offerings. So I think what's exciting now and new are these practices and these mental models and these frameworks like design thinking that really, force or require us to look through the lens of the user and the experiences that they have with our offerings. So I can't think of a better place to take advantage of the benefits of design thinking and Agile practices than HR. I mean, there's no better place to apply it.
And to your point, I do agree with you that HR professionals do care about people in general, but for whatever reason, the HR function itself has been really designed or centered around process and compliance and not so much about the understanding of people's needs and aspirations. So is it something that has to change in the way we train HR professionals, or is it something that still needs to happen and we need to keep those, but to bring more of an outside perspective, like designers like yourselves, to that HR space?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think the craft of professional designers, is helpful whenever you can apply it. And I think that, in the HR context, many times maybe it's outsourced as another part of the company or that sort of thing. But I think even more importantly than that, this idea of just thinking of user-centered practices as a skill. And so using your HR professional foundation and just building upon it by adding some of these new ways of working as a new skill. So design thinking and Agile, other Lean, for example, adding these to the core enablement of your HR teams is a quick way to sort of achieve these outcomes.
And what fascinates me about the employee experience is that it's a great opportunity to break down the silos in the organization, right? Because, again, not a lot of organizations are going to start with building an employee experience team from scratch. You may have to borrow people from different functions, different departments in your organization to actually build a sort of committee around the employee experience before you actually build a real team. From people from marketing, from customer experience, operations, IT, and then obviously HR. What would be your advice for our listeners who don't actually have the resources to actually create a real team from the start? What are the things that they would have to look at in order to start sort of designing the employee experience concepts?
I think that it reminds me of one of the core principles of design thinking, which is bring together a diverse, empowered team. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the projects and the solutions that we work on that result in creating experiences for employees, in most, if not all cases, having a complete experience on the employee side requires multiple teams behind the scenes working horizontally across HR and sometimes outside of HR to make that experience the best it can be. So the idea of bringing together, a diverse, sort of multidisciplinary, but also cross-organizational team.
Yes.
That's a part of pretty much every initiative that we get involved in. And I just can't imagine successful outcomes without taking an approach like that when you're trying to create these holistic employee experiences.
So what would be the first item or the first action that's a group would need to take in order to conceptualize the employee experience in the organization?
So I'm a little biased. I'm obviously a huge enterprise design thinking fan, but it's something that I've just found leads us towards success over and over. And so my advice would be, to start with the three core principles of enterprise design thinking and jump right in. And so those three core principles are: one, focus on user outcomes. And in our case, our user is employees. Mm-hmm. So, focusing on outcomes for our employees. Two is one that is also sort of shared across Agile, which is this idea of like restless reinvention, which translates to, iteration, right? But iteration based on feedback and input and
right.
Prototyping. And then the last one we talked about, a couple minutes ago, which is leveraging this diverse, empowered, multidisciplinary and cross-functional team. So I think if you consider everything a prototype, which that's another idea in design thinking, but even if you sort of consider a prototype your own expertise and comfort level with design thinking and just jump in and start prototyping and iterating by using those three core principles, then I think you're well on your way. I think that's a great start.
Can you share with us some recent successes that you've had with your team?
Oh, wow. Sure. I don't know. I think I'll just say that, we've had sort of, like I mentioned, what I would call the pleasure of bringing together and collaborating with members of, just many teams and functions across our global HR organization. As you can imagine, it's massive. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to bring, teams together, sometimes for the first time, to reimagine some of our key IBMer experiences. And it's just been fantastic to be a part of that. And, we have many more to go and many things to get to, but we're well on our way. So I think, in order to, one of the things I would say has been a pretty big success is that in order for us as a small team to more quickly, scale our thought leadership and, patterns that we found to be successful, is we went to great lengths to craft what we call the IBMer Experience Playbook and an associated toolkit. And it's helping to empower our HR professionals and teams across the globe to improve and make more cohesive, all the different, HR offerings and touch points that we deliver.
You were talking a bit earlier about focusing on the outcomes for the employees. Now, we talk a lot about employee experience, employee engagements, and people use one word or another, which really they're not the same. So the first question would be, how do you differentiate employee experience and employee engagement? And the second question would be, how do you define the outcomes for the employees?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about employee experience, I think employee experience is a collection of all the individual touch points and experiences that employees have with their employer. And so, we're constantly, restlessly reinventing those experiences to be better and better and better. And when we talk about engagement, it's those experiences that are a part of the formula that drive employee engagement. So employee engagement is much more than just the touch points or offerings that we sort of provide to create these experiences. There's actually many other experiences that an employee has outside of that scope, but all in service of driving, better employee engagement. So I think employee experience leads to and is a part of driving employee engagement.
How do you define what the outcomes for the employees should be? That's
where I would say, we try not to do that. We try not to define what those outcomes are, especially up front. What I would say our approach is to identify needs and then develop solutions to meet those needs. And there's a balance there of the employee needs, but also the business needs. And, coming up with solutions that can achieve both is really where the magic happens. And until you do the research and leverage the sponsor users to come up with and fully understand what the needs are, and then using your multidisciplinary team to really ideate on what the solutions to those needs could be, that's when the outcomes get defined.
How do you measure the results of the effectiveness of an employee experience strategy?
I think that you mentioned engagement. Obviously, that's a very important metric and input. I think any ways that you can get feedback, or any feedback is helpful feedback. I think there are other methods depending on the offering or touch point. Things like NPS can go a long way in helping to understand that. But there are many other KPIs and metrics depending on the offering or depending on the project that should be considered. NPS isn't the one all be all, and actually can be overused. So you have to be very intentional. But yeah, I think it varies widely.
So do you guys at IBM measure the effectiveness of your employee experience strategy based on business performance indicators?
Yeah, I think that that's a tough one, especially at the scale at which we operate. Mm-hmm. So again, I think we try to identify the KPIs or the metrics based upon the outcomes that we're trying to drive for each individual, project or offering. And some of those projects and offerings do have, sort of direct impact on, either sales or client outcomes. Many times they might not, or it may be a downstream effect, not a direct correlation. So again, I think it's taking a look at the experience or a user journey and determining, what are the metrics or KPIs that we can identify that help sort of let us know whether we're on track to meet the outcomes that have been defined. So it's really taking a look at those individually that I think has the most value.
So from your journey at IBM and in your current role, what are some of the pitfalls to avoid that you could share with our listeners?
Oh, I always love this question. There's a few of my favorites I can share. Let's see. I touched on one earlier, which is one I see a lot, but it's being a subject matter expert doesn't make us a sponsor user. So I can't underestimate the importance of having sponsor users. And again, that quote of, we're not our users. So let's make sure to bring them into the process. I think, let's see, a few of the others might be, consider, both design thinking and Agile sort of have this sort of inherent built-in, iteration and feedback loop. And, so considering everything a prototype is a good mental model. And how that translates to like something to avoid would be, don't start with, building your wedding cake is what we like to say a lot. It's shoot for that minimum delightful experience. Let's create a cupcake first. We're giving the full experience of the cake and the icing and the sprinkles just on a very small scale. You still get the full experience, and then we'll build up to the wedding cake over time. We'll go from a cupcake to a birthday cake, maybe, because it's much faster and easier to iterate than it is to create.
How do you see the employee experience evolve at IBM in the next, let's say, 5 years or so?
Wow, 5 years. 5 years almost seems like a lifetime these days, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think it's really hard, I think, to look 5 years out these days. I think with the constant evolution and this, the restlessly reinventing that many of us are all doing, while we love it, it's hard to say what things are going to look like 5 years out. But I would say from my own point of view and the work that our team is doing, we're just constantly maturing sort of our organizational point of view about how we are, sort of optimizing the organization around employee experience. And for us, it's, what's ahead of us and what we're looking towards is how can we leverage, user journeys to help the organization work more effectively to deliver these more holistic, experiences for our users or for our employees across journeys as opposed to individual touch points. And so I think that you'll see a lot of that in the future as well.
So do you in your current role use a Watson in the employee experience design?
Yeah, we use it quite a bit. There are, many of our, offerings or touch points or experiences that use multiple Watson technologies, lots of Watson APIs. So depending on the solution, depending on the offering, it can use any combination of those capabilities from Watson. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you see technologies like Watson and AI and machine learning influence the personalization of the employee experience? Because more and more companies are looking at AI and automation and machine learning and artificial and Internet of Things to create more personalized experiences on the customer side. And literally, we can apply those same ideas on the employee side.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity here when, sort of like what you described, when you see the value it can bring to, commercial experiences or consumer experiences. Many of those same things can be, some of those same patterns can be directly applied to employee experience as well. So, using some of these capabilities and technologies can make our experiences more warm and more informed and more, like you said, personalized. It can also, augment, not only our HR teams, but the individual employees, sort of making them even more effective. So I think that there's tremendous potential here, and I think we're just getting started on that journey.
Do you think that technology and the human touch in the employee experience are compatible?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, just like anything, if not used properly, it can be, disruptive or cause undue friction. But I think when used well and used properly, I think there's tremendous potential in bringing these things closer and closer together. I think it has, tremendous potential to, sort of like I mentioned, have the experiences be, more efficient, but also, warmer, richer, and more relevant to the individual. But I think just like anything here, especially when we start talking about data and AI and, machine learning and other things, that's where that's where the ethics are so important, and the values, and using these things in very thoughtful and helpful ways. So I can't underestimate sort of the importance of ethics. And we've done a lot of thought leadership just as a company here on the ethics of these technologies.
So before we conclude our conversation today, because we've been very serious about the employee experience, so let me ask you some fun questions. If you were to invite a historical figure, someone famous to dinner, who would you pick and why?
Okay, hopefully I'm not breaking your rules, but I'm gonna pick a couple.
Sure.
So it's well, not two, but a couple. I am obviously a huge design fan, and I'm a little biased, but if I could have anyone, I'm a huge fan of Ray and Charles Eames. And if you're not familiar with them as a couple, they're famous designers from, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And, you can find Eames architecture, furniture, or even some films and exhibitions that they did. And they were also IBMers, so I really love that as well. But I've always been a huge fan of their work, their design aesthetic. And they actually seem like a really kind of fun-loving couple to hang out with. And yeah, I would love to have met them. And I have 2 of their pieces of furniture at home.
Oh, that's awesome. Which profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so I mentioned architecture already. That's a huge passion. But I would say beyond that, maybe something in the realm of like industrial design, which is like the design of physical objects. So that I think, designing something tangible that I could hold in my hands is pretty interesting to me.
What is the most fascinating object that you've seen?
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to go back to my go-to around architecture and some of the incredible structures that I've had the chance to witness. There's a couple incredible palaces in the Middle East that just knocked my socks off. The Burj Khalifa in Dubai, just how incredibly impressive that structure was a joy to visit. So those are some of my favorites.
All right, so let's go the travel route then. What is your favorite vacation spot?
I tend to be a fan of warm, sunny, sandy places. I guess my favorite sunny, sandy one would be Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. But then if on the flip side, if I'm going to do something cold and snowy, I'm a huge fan of Whistler, which is just north of Vancouver in Canada.
Yeah. What is the essential item that you always take with you when you go on vacation?
Let's see, what's always in my bag? I'd probably say my iPad, because I have to have my podcast and my books and my news, even if I'm, kind of quote unquote disconnected.
What is your favorite word?
Thanks.
Your least favorite word?
Probably ASAP.
Okay, that's quite a good one. It's quite unusual.
That one drives me crazy.
What's the way for our listeners to follow you and IBM on social media?
I would, obviously IBM. That one's easy to find. For me, for better or worse, I'm pretty much, my handle is @Damon Diener. Just about everywhere.
Okay, so LinkedIn and Twitter.
Yep.
Good. Any last word of advice or wisdom for our listeners?
Outside of all the things we talked about, I think a good one, both in a personal and a professional context, is, when in doubt, always assume positive intent.
I like it. Always assume positive intent. That's very good. Well, thank you, Damon, for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Stefan, for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.